Are you pleased to see the statutory national inquiry into grooming gangs be announced?
Yes, we've been calling on this for about 6 months, and Keir Starmer has at last agreed, but he had to be dragged here kicking and screaming. He's not doing this because he wants to or because he believes in it. He's doing this because he was forced to, forced partly by the Casey report and partly by the vote that we have scheduled in Parliament on Wednesday. When this first came out, the need for a national inquiry into the cover-up in January, Keir Starmer smeared people like me and other campaigners. He claimed we were part of a far-right bandwagon. That is a disgraceful smear. And in fact, when he said that, Keir Starmer was essentially perpetuating the same attitude that led to the cover-up in the first place. So I hope Keir Starmer is going to apologise to campaigners for that disgraceful smear he tried in January. But it is good that he has at last been forced to adopt this inquiry.
I guess the first point just to acknowledge on this is you're saying he's been dragged into this decision 6 months late. You must acknowledge equally that your government didn't introduce this for 14 years previously.
Well, the last government did a lot. For example, initiating the Rotherham inquiry back in 2014, the independent inquiry into child sex abuse that was much wider but did cover this, that ran for 7 years. Sajid Javid started collecting ethnicity data in about 2018, and then Rishi Sunak established the Grooming Gangs Task Force, which led to 550 arrests. Now, what then happened after the election is Oldham Council said, look, we can't investigate this ourselves. We need a national inquiry, including into the cover-up. Now, the Labour government contemptuously dismissed that request by Oldham Council, and that became public in January, and that is when the campaign really began. Look,
I think it's very legitimate to criticise some of the framing of why an inquiry wasn't held over 6 months ago, and to say that perhaps this could have happened quicker on the last government. For you, essentially, what I'm hearing, the only legitimate excuse you have for not introducing a statutory national inquiry is that Oldham Council hadn't called for it yet.
Well, as I said, there were a whole load of things done by the previous
I get that, but you weren't, when you were in government, as a junior minister or a senior minister in various different roles, calling for one then. And then the day the election passes, you change your tune. Essentially, you're saying the only difference is that Oldham Council called for it. As a government, you could have done this yourselves earlier.
Well, just to be clear, I wasn't the Home Secretary and I wasn't the safeguarding minister. And it was only when this call by Oldham Council, and I only became Shadow Home Secretary in November.
Fine. You're here to speak for your party as a whole.
Yeah, and look, and within a few weeks of becoming Shadow Home Secretary, when Oldham Council's request became public, because Labour didn't mention it for a number of months, then we looked at what they were saying, what Oldham Council was saying, and the view that I reached as the new Shadow Home Secretary, and the view that Kemi Badenoch reached as the new leader of the Conservative Party, is that a statutory inquiry was necessary to get to the bottom of the cover-up. And what I've heard in the last few months, meeting retired police officers and meeting survivors, and what has really shocked me, has been the way that this was deliberately covered up over years and possibly decades. It wasn't that people were just negligent or just didn't sort of look into it properly. They deliberately and actively covered it up. And I'm talking about senior police officers, local council leaders, social services, the Crown Prosecution Service. And the reason they deliberately covered it up for years was because the victims were mainly very young white girls, often from troubled backgrounds, from care homes and so on, whereas the perpetrators were mainly of Pakistani heritage, and people in authority at the time were more concerned about so-called race relations than they were about protecting young girls. That is absolutely disgusting, frankly. Not a single one of those people has been held to account. There's a criminal offence called misconduct in public office, and I think those people, and I'm not talking about a handful, it's probably dozens or maybe hundreds of people in positions of authority over the years deliberately covered this up. I think they're guilty of that criminal offence and, frankly, should be going to prison. I'll give you one example.
Well, no, hold on, sorry. We're going to come in a moment to the Prime Minister's rhetoric towards you and people like you in a moment. But you were in authority. You're here to talk on respect for your party as a whole here. Your party was in government for 14 years, and you're saying that people in authority are responsible for this. And essentially what you're saying is the only thing that changed was that one council, a small council, said that this was necessary, and that changed your position to say there needs to be a national statutory inquiry. I mean, that's saying that you in authority weren't doing enough yourselves.
As I said, I became Shadow Home Secretary in November.
Fine, but then you were explicitly criticising your former colleagues in government who occupied government for 14 years.
No, I'm saying, look, I've already gone through the list of the things the last government did, right? The Jay inquiry, the Rotherham inquiry, the grooming gangs task force, the collection of ethnicity data.
But you're saying that an Oldham council call for a national statutory inquiry was the only reason why the facts changed?
My view today is that all of those things the last government did were important, they were valid, but I think we need to go further. And I said that in Parliament. This is not news. I've said before that we should go further by having this statutory national inquiry to get to the bottom of the cover-up. And I'll give you an example of how this was covered up. There's a retired Detective Chief Inspector called John Peacock. He spent 30 years in GMP, and after his retirement, he worked for a charity investigating child sex abuse. Now, first of all, in Oldham, when he was a police officer in 2000, he was instructed by a senior officer to basically discontinue an investigation into abuse, and Oldham Social Services withdrew their support for his investigation. And then again, in 2010, when he was working for a charity after his retirement, he was again investigating child sexual abuse, this time in Bradford. He'd actually witnessed it with his own eyes, it's taking place in a taxi driver's car. And when he tried to raise this issue, a chief superintendent in the Bradford Police phoned him up, someone he knew from when he was in the force, phoned him up and said, just stop investigating this. I don't want to inflame tensions with Bradford's Muslim community. That is disgraceful. That senior police officer, he was either a superintendent or a chief superintendent, I think he's guilty of misconduct in public office as a result of what he did then, deliberately ignoring and, in fact, deliberately stopping an investigation into very young girls, like 10, 11, 12 years old, getting abused by these taxi drivers. That is absolutely disgraceful, and he and many others like him need to be held to account. Obviously,
he's not here to give us his right of reply on that, but assuming all of what you said is accurate, it is disgraceful. Hypothetically, let's suppose. But you've just said 2008, you said 2010, you said 2013. Surely that is the Conservative government at the time's responsibility, not Keir Starmer's.
Well, I've already listed all the things the last government did.
But they were not enough.
Yeah, they should have gone further.
And you said that the people in authority at the time may have shown criminal neglect.
So which
would be talking about your colleagues.
The people who deliberately... No, so people like, the then Home Secretaries initiated all of the inquiries I've described. The evidence...
Which were not sufficient.
The cover-ups that I've described by, for example, that police officer, by Oldham Social Services in 2010, even as recently as last week, there was a trial convicting 7 men of Pakistani origin of abuse between 2001 and 2006. Social Services in Rochdale at the time described a 10-year-old girl who was a victim as a prostitute. Right, there are 3 examples. Now, those are local police forces, local councils, local social services. The Crown Prosecution Service, prior to 2010, didn't prosecute some of these cases properly. Those are the people who deliberately covered this up.
It is all horrific. And almost can't even imagine how horrific it is. But if the Prime Minister is guilty of taking too long, 6 months, to initiate this statutory national inquiry, then you must acknowledge that the Conservative government, over 14 years, is also guilty of taking too long and not doing enough. Well,
I've already gone through, I think 3 times now, all of the things the last government did. The Jay inquiry, the Rotherham inquiry, the grooming gangs task force.
Are you saying you deserve praise for that and the government deserves criticism for 6 months of delays? Or do you also acknowledge, despite listing all of those things for 3 times, that it wasn't enough and that you deserve almost as much, if not more, criticism for not doing enough to stop this for 14 years? No, I've gone through what the last government did, which was very, very extensive indeed. We were in the process of implementing the Jay recommendations when the election was called. But when this new evidence came out from Oldham Council and this testimony from people like John Peacock, that DCI I mentioned, that only came out about 2 months ago. Keir Starmer should have responded quickly. He's the Prime Minister today. And when this was raised, I think it was in early January, at a press conference he was giving, he smeared people. He smeared campaigners as jumping on a far-right bandwagon. That's what he said, a far-right bandwagon. A few months later, the Leader of the Commons said it was, quotes, a dog whistle, even to raise the issue at all. Now, no Conservative ever spoke in those terms. It is, frankly, Keir Starmer should apologise for that disgraceful smear, calling it a far-right bandwagon. It is not a far-right bandwagon to stand up for girls aged as young as 10 who are being systematically abused, where that abuse was then deliberately covered up because the perpetrators were predominantly of Pakistani heritage. That is absolutely wrong. It's not a far-right bandwagon, and Keir Starmer should be apologising.